Hey y'all, this is Truck Stop Mixtape. It's me, Giovanni, and I'm so happy because I get to do this in this crazy week, and I need this Bowie light. Some of you need it too. And more than that, I need to know more about Bowie. I've read books, I've listened to all the albums a gazillion times, and there's still so much I don't know about the man. And when I reached out to friends, everyone had a particular thing that they were passionate about with Bowie. And my friend Michael DeAngelis, who has a radio show called There Once Was a Note, is a big Robert Fripp fan. And he's going to talk to me about Robert Fripp and David Bowie and that whole relation. And let's bring him on. Hold on, here we go.
Hey,
Michael,
Jim.
what's up?
How you doing?
Doing all right, man. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for constantly being a source of enlightenment and providing so much inspiration for me and Truck Stop Mixtape with what you do with your show. There Once Was a Note, and I really appreciate you coming on and giving me a little Fripp, a little mini Fripp lesson.
Right. Well, staying right back at you too for Truck Stop Mixtape, because I think the show is fantastic, and as you know, I pass it around every time you post on Facebook. So I hope more people
appreciate that, man.
Yep.
Me too. Thank you so much.
So
So
we talked about Fripp, and
yeah, please.
he was part of the Berlin trilogy. He came in on the second album, Heroes. He wasn't on Lodger. That was Adrian Belew and Carlos Alomar. And then he came back for Scary Monsters, which for me, Scary Monsters was almost like the fourth part of the Berlin trilogy. He didn't really break away from what he did on those three albums. It was kind of like the next logical step. But there are a lot of pieces to that puzzle of how that music happened that seem unconnected on the surface. And it all starts with Les Paul, believe it or not. Les Paul multi-tracked his recordings and wanted to do on stage what he did on record, which for one guy with a guitar is impossible unless you invent the Les Paulverizer, which he did. And I sent you a photo of that. You get the photo of that. And what that was a box that attached to the bottom of his guitar and allowed him to access tape loops of other parts of the performance. So, and he could kick these parts in at any time he chose to. He just pressed the buttons and there it was.
Do you remember what year it was that he created this?
I don't, because when I looked it up, the only thing I could not find was the year that he created it. But what I did see was that the stuff he was doing with that was also the beginning of the things that Fripp and Eno were doing almost simultaneously. So it wasn't like decades before Fripp and Eno did their thing, but he was one of the early pioneers of that. And what happened with Fripp and Eno was Eno had left Roxy Music. He was out on his own. Fripp was at the end of the Wetton and Bruford King Crimson. It was going to come to an end very shortly around the time they hooked up. They did an album called No Pussyfooting. And it was really the first album of that kind, because what happened is Fripp and Eno kind of took the same technology that Les Paul had going on. But the differences that they made was that Eno would do a tape loop, and it wouldn't be constant. In the Les Paul performances, it would be constant because he's performing a song and everything's got to go the way that it's got to go. With Eno would manipulate the loops so that he could bring something in, it would fade out, he could change the pitch, he could do anything he wanted with it. And it would be layer after layer after layer. And that's what the No Pussyfooting album is. That led to Fripp eventually going off and doing Frippertronics, and that led to Eno going into his ambient music, which I told you the story of the ambient music. Eno had surgery, and he was at home, and a friend bought him a small phonograph and some records. And Eno's laying in bed, and you know what it's like laying in bed. You don't want to get up and change the records or turn up the volume or turn it down or whatever. And one of the speakers shorted out. So he's listening to these records at very low volume with half the channel coming through. And he said that taught him to hear music in a whole new way. And the way he described his ambient music, which it was music for airports and music for films, were the first two albums to call themselves ambient music. He said he wanted the music to be as easily ignored as it was interesting. That was his label for it. But what it was about
Not a good selling point, but hey,
Yeah, well, I know it worked for him though, didn't it?
it did.
But the thing is that this brings in the Bowie trajectory of how this all
Okay.
came together. Bowie had the Diamond Dogs album, which for me was the last Mick Ronson album, even though Mick Ronson didn't play on it. It's an album that Ronson easily could have played on and fits in with Spiders and Aladdin Sane and all the stuff that came before it. After Diamond Dogs, he did Young Americans, which I hate to pick one word to describe the album, but a lot of people do call that his soul album.
Correct. Yeah.
While he was doing Young Americans, he was listening to Kraftwerk. And one of the things about Bowie, you can really sum up his career in one sentence from front to back, and that is he paid attention to everything and ignored nothing. And sometimes he would bring in an element and he'd go full bore on it. Other times he'd bring in a little piece of it, a little something from here, a little something from there, or whatever. So he did the Soul album, and while he's doing it, he's listening to Kraftwerk. After that, or during that time, I can't recall which, he goes to Paris, goes to France, whatever, mainly to detox from the Station to Station years. And while he's in France, he's recording Iggy Pop and listening to Kraftwerk, and then he picks up the circus and moves it to Berlin. And that's where the Berlin trilogy happened. So initially, the Low album was Bowie and Eno. They brought in Fripp for Heroes, and then he came back after the third album in the trilogy, Lodger, for Scary Monsters. And the thing that Bowie was doing, and he started this on Station to Station, that's where it really happened for the first time. He was getting away from the 3 to 4 minute rock or pop song where, you know, boy meets girl, has a fast car, gets high, whatever. And he was never really
basically getting away from the sort of the classic rock conventions and the stuff that kind of made him famous for a minute with the Ronson years. You know, it's just straightforward radio rock, if you want to call it.
Yeah, and he never really played on that playing field anyway.
Maybe no, he was already kind of like off of that. But.
Yeah, the first couple of albums when he was still David Jones and still, you know, getting up to speed on that. But when he did Man Who Sold the World, Hunky Dory, those albums, those aren't traditional pop songs by any means. And so he already was twisting every convention he could of the 3 to 4 minute pop song. But when he got to Station, that's where it was stuff that you had the elements of Kraftwerk and the so-called krautrock, that whole realm of that music. It was the electronic stuff. It was elements of the ambient music or whatever. So the natural next step was to bring in Brian Eno, because he really knew how to twist things inside out and explore all of the options. So Fripp, the thing about Fripp that amazed me on the Heroes album and on the song itself, which I told you, I've got every album Bowie ever recorded. And I would have to say the Heroes might be my favorite song out of them all. And the reason for that is that a little over a month, like 5 weeks after 9/11 happened, they had the concert for New York.
Yeah.
And they had all of the first responders in the front row. It was one of the few times where you didn't have headliners like Bowie, The Who, McCartney, and record execs didn't get those front row seats. It was all the first responders. And Bowie opened the show with Paul Simon's America and Heroes. And when he did Heroes, everybody in that front row was on their feet. They had their hands in the air. They had smiles from ear to ear.
Yeah.
They were bumping asses. They were just in a state of bliss after like one of the worst events in U.S. history. And so the power of the song came through then. And it was a good song before that happened, but it was an even better song 2 decades later, 2.5 decades later when he did that.
Yeah, it took on a new life.
The other thing about the song is that I might have mentioned to you that I had seen Fripp on Peter Gabriel's first tour after leaving Genesis. And during the concert, he had Steve Hunter in the band, who played with Lou Reed and Alice Cooper. And Steve Hunter is your Pete Townsend windmill, guitar face, leather pants guitarist, right? Fripp sat on a stool, and Gabriel introduced him as Dusty Rhodes, an obscure country guitar player. Okay? They did Here Comes the Flood. And the version of Here Comes the Flood they did was closer to the version that was on Fripp's Exposure album, which had Gabriel's vocals on it. But it took away all the orchestral stuff and the whole big sound that was very stark and very stripped down or whatever. And there's a part in the song, there's a line, the hollow shoulder across the water. And when Gabriel sang that line, Fripp bent one note. And the guy behind me bellowed, "Fripp!" And the audience exploded. The audience was on their feet for one note. Okay. And that taught me one of the biggest lessons in music and as a guitarist. But the reason I bring that up is in Heroes, he's basically bending one note. And there
Yeah.
are places in the song where he's playing a few notes, but the one note that it's a bent and then sustained note that goes all the way through the verses. And that's Fripp.
Yeah.
So Bowie was the king of bombast and glam and whatever you want to call it with Ziggy Stardust, and he went completely minimalist and then stripped everything down and went for the space around the notes instead of the notes themselves. And he went from Young Americans to the Berlin Trilogy to Scary Monsters and then to Let's Dance, which basically went full circle back to Young Americans, but with Nile Rodgers and Stevie Ray Vaughan on guitar. And so that's the only time in his career he really went full circle. He started off with Young Americans. He did the whole crazy stuff with Fripp and Eno and everybody, got back to that. And then after that, for the rest of his career, his remaining 10 albums after Let's Dance, he pulled little pieces and added new pieces too. But he never really went into one real dramatic shift in what he was doing. He pretty much revisited what he'd done previously.
I mean, there was some part there, I guess in the 90s when he was messing with a different kind of dance music, you know, like the more drum and bass and techno elements as opposed to the funk stuff that he kind of did with Young Americans and Soul and Let's Dance, but never there were never any more left turns, like sharp turns. Definitely. I mean, I think Let's Dance was actually the last sharp turn.
Well, he did Earthling, and Earthling was the album that had him a Friend of America.
That's right. That's right.
I think that's the one you're referring to.
That's the one. Yeah, the Union Jack.
And there was a specific style for like the bass and drums and beats sound that he did. I can't recall the name of it right off the top of my head. It has a name.
Drums and bass, they call it.
Yeah, and
drum and bass.
It didn't really go over gangbusters, and he didn't really follow through with it. But it was one album where people were seeing that this is not a guy that's not going to want to just keep regurgitating his greatest hits. I mean, he's going to keep trying stuff.
No, he was always experimenting. I mean, there was a lot of controversy with that album too, because apparently he reached out to several people in that field to work with him, and they said no. Like the guy from what was that crazy? I can only remember the song title, "Smack My Bitch Up." But anyway, just like some people famously saying no to Bowie. But going back to the Fripp connection,
mm-hmm.
Scary Monsters is one of my favorite albums, and I love how, like you said, it's such a perfect bridge between the first three, and also a bridge into Let's Dance.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's the most sort of commercial he sounded with Fripp ever.
Well, yeah, and that goes back to the thing about we were talking about station to station kind of abandoning the song format, and especially on Low, I think Low is probably the album where Eno's influence is strongest, and that may be because of the absence of Fripp. When he brought Fripp in, Fripp is not going to be just like one more layer on the thing. You're going to know Fripp's there. And for a lot of people, Scary Monsters is their favorite album. I've heard a lot of people just flat out call that their favorite Bowie album. But Fripp has that style that, and you know, one more connection if you want it. The Lodger album had Adrian Belew playing guitars with Carlos Alomar, so there's a connection. You know, Adrian Belew, King Crimson. And so Fripp was interesting because the Wetton and Bruford King Crimson was like, they call Neil Young the godfather of grunge. That edition of King Crimson was the godfather of what they call progressive metal. Bands like Dream Theater probably wouldn't exist, or they'd sound more like Genesis if King Crimson hadn't done that edition. But he really rode that out to the end. I mean, that was a band that thoroughly imploded. And after that, instead of going into something just like it, he went into like the soundscapes and the tape loops and all this other kind of stuff. And his interaction with Eno kind of led to what became the Ballou King Crimson. But all of this stuff, it sounds like I'm going in 20 different directions at once, and I am. But the point of it is that Bowie paid attention to every one of those 20 different directions, including Les Paul.
Yeah. Yeah, he was always about the big picture. He knew exactly what he wanted, but gave the musicians he worked with all the freedom and all the sort of space to do what they did best. And that's why he's so missed, man.
That is. And then, one final thing I'll add to that is Reeves Gabriel's in Tin Machine is really Frippy.
He is Frippy. I mean, you can say the same about Adrian Ballou too. It's like in a weird way, like those. He's got he's got the need for the yin and yang. Like he needs a solid Mick Ronson or a solid sort of Carlos Alomar funky guy, but then on the other side he needs that sort of extremist of the Fripp, the Blues, the Reeves.
Well, he used Earl Slick too, which I mean.
Earl Slick, another solid, straight, great rock and roll guitarist.
Alomar's kind of the technically brilliant guy who knows what to play and how to play it. Slick's more of the rebel who might, throw a surprise into the mix.
Yeah.
Because he played with like Phantom and Rocker from Stray Cats, Phantom Rocker and Slick for them.
Oh yeah. Yep. Straight up rock and roll.
Yeah, so Robert Fripp, all props to Robert Fripp.
The one thing that I remember when this is something that I remember hearing when I was younger about Robert Fripp, because you mentioned Peter Gabriel, and I don't know if that was the same tour that you saw him on, but that he would play behind the curtain, like he wouldn't be seen. He didn't want to be in front of like in with the band, and he had to have like sort of an eye line of where Peter was. Just to maintain, like, and he just wanted to make, he's like, I'm here for him. I don't want to be a show off or anything. I'm here doing the soundscape in the background. And I can't remember. I think the story was there was somebody who had snuck backstage to see Peter Gabriel, and they were just so surprised that they were backstage and not getting caught. And that they got somebody tapped him on the shoulder, and it was Robert Fripp, and he was sitting on a stool behind the stage, saying, "Excuse me, lad, do you mind if I just move to the side a little bit? I need to keep an eye on Peter Gabriel."
Well, this tour that I saw, he was on stage, but he was about as far back to like the drum riser as you could be, and he sat on the stool, and he basically played and didn't say a word. And Steve Hunter, on the other hand, was doing all of the crotch rock stuff and bouncing all over the stage. And he was dressed in black leather. I mean, it was like he got a cab from the Lou Reed show and came right over, But the whole nondescript thing was when Fripp introduced him. He said, an obscure country player, Dusty Rhodes. And the audience blew up then because I'll tell you, the friends that I knew that were into prog rock at the time loved Genesis. They were there to see Peter Gabriel. But there were a whole lot of people that were there to see Fripp, and I was one of them. I want to see them both equally, and he did not disappoint. But one note, my friend, one note, and he tore that roof off. One note. Fripp! It was one of the greatest moments I ever had in a concert all my life.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for joining me. Again, I got to have you as often as possible. I appreciate all the knowledge and the Frippness for this particular episode of Truck Stop Mixtape. Bowie was amazing. His talent was definitely to put things together, like you said, get all these sort of influences from all these different kinds of art forms and bring them, and then also unleash them onto these amazing musicians that he would gather and I love the guy, but thank you. I love you too, brother. Thank you for being here, man. Be
Peace.
good.
And as I said, Gio, you're welcome on my show anytime as well. Thanks for having me. Take care.
You're going to regret that. Bye.
I'm right.
Bye.